It was indeed a beautiful building, rising out of the prairie in red and white grandeur. Its rooms were ample and well adapted for their purpose of learning and teaching. And by September, above the silvery dome, a flag would float and a bell would ring out, calling students to the first classes of the second term. But the Board of Education was concerned. Because of the country's financial panic and local bank failures, thousands of dollars in original pledges could not be collected. $65,000 in debts hung over the building, and there was neither money or credit to pay the bills. At the board's annual meeting, President Samuel Moulton described the financial crisis facing the university.
The encumbrances upon this property must be discharged, or the whole of it will have to be abandoned to the rapacity of the creditors.
The board concluded that in order to keep the university operating, the state legislature would have to appropriate money to pay the debts. A bill for the state to appropriate funds to complete and furnish the building was presented to the legislature in January. And on February 14, 1861, Governor Richard Yates signed the bill into law. Everyone involved in the university was greatly relieved, especially Principal Hovey. The thinking was that perhaps now the university could move forward, free of debt and financial embarrassment. While the new university was struggling financially, a great national conflict was rapidly approaching. Events on the national scene were never far from the minds of the students at Illinois State Normal University.
When the term opened in 1860, there was great political excitement. Lincoln and Douglas were battling it out for the presidency. Each candidate had a large personal following, and our professors made sure we knew what our native sons stood for. After Lincoln was elected, the local newspapers allowed us to follow the progress of his trip east for the inaugural. We wondered, what would Lincoln do once he took office? He'd campaigned on national unity, but secession in the South was already happening. We discussed if the South was really willing to fight for slavery, and we worried how long before we university men would be preparing for war. John H. Burnham, class of 1861.
The answer came a month after Lincoln took office. The first news came by telegraph on Friday, April 12, 1861. Fort Sumter had been fired upon. President Lincoln immediately called for 75,000 three-month recruits to quell the uprising in Charleston. The call for soldiers spread like wildfire throughout McLean County. That night, a crowd gathered at the downtown square. William H. Harvey, a veteran of the Mexican War, respected for high character and courage, opened the window of the courthouse and called for volunteers, announcing that he would go with them. 113 young men pressed forward to sign their names to an enlistment paper. Among them were 5 from the Normal University. Patriotism was no longer a rhetorical figure to these university men, but a living reality. The next morning, Principal Charles Hovey and his assistant Ira Moore met privately to discuss the effect the war might have on the Normal University. The spring term had just begun. The financial crisis was over, and Hovey did not want to see the school disrupted again. But the young men of the university were restless. They really missed their comrades who had enlisted and believed they were shirking their duty by not serving. Principal Hovey called together his students and told them,
"The need for teachers is critical. Those who stand behind the desk and teach serve the nation as well as those who take up arms."
Hovey and Moore really understood the feelings of these young men because they wanted to serve as well, but they also wanted to train men teachers. So to address this, they hired John W. White as a drill master. and it was his job to turn these clodhoppers of normal into the normal rifles. So he taught the school of the soldier: do the manual of arms together, stand straight, march together. So at the close of classes every day, he'd take the rifles out to the old brickyard and march them around with their wooden muskets. Now the term ended without these young men being called, but to keep them from enlisting in the summer, Hovey promised them that if their services were needed, he would raise a teacher's regiment and call them all together as a group.
Determined to find out how long the war would last, Hovey and his trusted friend, Jesse Fell, set off for Washington to talk the matter over with Secretary of War Simon Cameron and President Lincoln.
Hovey and Fell arrived in Washington on July 21st, 1861, just in time to hear some very disquieting rumors from the front that a great battle had been fought and probably lost.
In a few hours, citizens, businessmen, and even members of Congress who had crossed the Potomac that morning to watch the Union drub the rebels began to pour into Washington in a panic retreat. They confirmed that General McDowell's Union forces were indeed engaged in a ferocious battle with General Beauregard's Confederates at Manassas Creek.
Well, Hovey and Fell wanted to see the battle just like everyone else in Washington. They made their way to the Potomac River, where they obtained a boat and crossed the river into Alexandria, Virginia. Once they got into Alexandria, then they came upon a train loaded with reinforcements for the front. They climbed onto one of the cars and headed out.
As they approached the front near Centerville, the smoke from the guns and cannons hung heavy in the air. Dead and dying men lay everywhere. Fell stopped at the First Field Hospital, threw off his coat, and gave his services to the surgeons. Hovey pushed on, continuing his advance until he reached the line where the men were engaged. He was one of the few civilians who witnessed at least part of the Battle of Bull Run. After the Union's humiliating defeat, Congress authorized the President to call for the services of 500,000 volunteers for 3 years. The Union was now formally recruiting an army to take on the Confederates.
Hovey realized that this was going to be more than a 3-month war. So in honoring his promise to the Normal Rifles, he visited President Lincoln and tendered his services. Lincoln accepted and commissioned him a colonel in the Union Army.
Hovey hurried home to call back the Rifles and recruit more men for the Teachers' Regiment.
The Teachers, or Normal Regiment, was officially known as the 33rd Regiment Illinois Volunteer Infantry, and the unit had several distinctions. Among them was the fact that 46 of the members were Normalites, meaning they were faculty, students, or graduates of the Normal University, and this made the unit one of the more highly educated units in all of the Union Army. Now, since most of the recruits were students, the average age was quite low. In fact, in one company of 100, only 4 were of adult age. In another company, 13 were college graduates, and they all served as privates.
There was a story that went around about the regiment that said that if a soldier was discharged from this regiment for mental incapacity or mental deficiency, something like that, that this person could actually be commissioned as an officer in any other regiment. There was another story that went around about them as well, that if an order came down from a higher command, that they would not obey that order unless it was absolutely correct in grammar and syntax.
Within 59 days, over 900 men in the 33rd Regiment had been recruited, organized, and equipped at Camp Butler in Springfield, then dispatched by train to Pilot Knob near Ironton, Missouri. Here, officers and their soldiers were in serious training for the battles that lay ahead. That night, as Colonel Hovey lay in his tent trying to sleep, he reminisced about the ceremony held in his honor the previous spring. He remembered being presented with a beautifully designed flag made by the women of the university for his Normal Rifles Regiment. And he recalled the enduring words by Sophie Christ, a member of the graduating class, as she made the presentation.
Colonel Hovey and the Normal Rifles, the ladies of the university have conferred upon me the honor of addressing you in their behalf. Hitherto we have known you only as teachers and schoolmates. We cannot say go forth to danger, and it may be to death. But if you go, you shall take with you this banner, which is to all our nation the emblem of our common freedom.
When the fall term of the university began, there were only about 80 students enrolled. 50 were from the freshman class. In Colonel Hovey's place was Perkins Bass, a member of the Board of Education from Chicago. He gave up his law practice and agreed to serve as temporary principal until Colonel Hovey returned from the war. In the young life of Illinois State Normal University, the coming of the Civil War marked the end of one era and the beginning of another.